a 9-year-old black boy. Elijah was about to embark on the most exciting journey of his young life, his first solo flight. With junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, a gift from his father, Captain Isaac Williams, who was piloting the very same plane, Elijah felt a mix of pride and excitement. But as soon as he boarded, everything changed. A racist flight attendant began singling him out, moving him to a cramped seat at the back of the plane, speaking to him coldly, and treating him like a nuisance in front of the other passengers. Just 7 minutes later, the other passengers started noticing what was happening, and their quiet support began to shift the dynamic on board. What happened next stunned everyone and led to an outcome that no one could have anticipated: a powerful lesson in courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of solidarity. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you find this story moving, don't forget to subscribe for more impactful and thought-provoking stories. Let's dive in. The morning sunlight crept through the blinds of the small, orderly bedroom. The walls were lined with posters of soaring airplanes, their wings frozen mid-flight, a promise of freedom and possibility. On a shelf, a neat row of model planes stood at attention, each one painted and polished to perfection by 9-year-old Elijah Williams. He was awake before the alarm, sitting on the edge of his neatly made bed, his small fingers gently tracing the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket. Today was the day, his first flight alone. Elijah's excitement was tempered by something deeper, something unspoken. His father, Captain Isaac Williams, a figure of unwavering strength in his crisp uniform, stood in the doorway. His voice was steady, warm, and measured, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Almost ready for takeoff, co-pilot? Isaac asked, his tone light but deliberate. Elijah stood, mimicking his father's commanding stance, though the weight of the morning seemed heavier than it should have been. "Yes, sir," he replied, his smile faltering for only a moment. Isaac crossed the room and adjusted the junior pilot wings on Elijah's jacket, his touch firm but gentle. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something Elijah couldn't yet name. "No matter what happens, keep your chin up. You belong, Elijah, always." "Yes, sir," Elijah replied, though a hint of doubt shadowed his bright eyes. The drive to the airport was filled with Elijah's rapid-fire questions about flying. "What's it like, Dad, being up in the clouds?" he asked, his wide-eyed curiosity shining through. Isaac laughed softly, his hands steady on the wheel. "It's like nothing else. Up there, everything on the ground seems so small. But remember, son, it's not just about flying, it's about taking care of everyone on board." As they approached the terminal, the towering planes on the tarmac seemed to gleam in the sunlight, their engines humming with purpose. But as Elijah stepped out of the car, clutching his backpack, he felt a pang of nervousness. Inside, the airport was a symphony of movement, hurried footsteps, announcements crackling over the intercom, and the hum of conversations in a dozen languages. Isaac's hand rested protectively on Elijah's shoulder as they navigated the bustling terminal. People nodded respectfully at Isaac, acknowledging his uniform. Elijah straightened his posture, proud to walk beside his father. At the security checkpoint, Isaac crouched to meet Elijah's gaze. "This is where I leave you for now," he said, his voice warm but resolute. "You remember everything we talked about?" "Yes, sir. Stay in my seat, listen to the flight attendants, and keep my seatbelt fastened," Elijah recited dutifully. Isaac smiled, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. "That's right. And remember, you're never alone. If you need anything, ask." He handed Elijah his boarding pass, then pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'll see you when you land, buddy." Elijah watched as his father walked away, tall and composed. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward the gate, clutching his boarding pass tightly. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman named Megan Carter, barely glanced up as Elijah approached. "Unaccompanied minor?" she asked curtly, her tone impersonal. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied politely. "My dad made sure everything's set." Megan handed him a tag to attach to his backpack, her fingers tapping impatiently on the counter. "Hold still," she muttered, not meeting his eyes. "My dad's the pilot on this flight," Elijah offered, hoping to bridge the distance with something personal. Megan's gaze flicked to him, a brief, skeptical glance, We treat everyone the same here, she said sharply. No need for tall tales. The words stung. Elijah's face grew hot with embarrassment. But he said nothing. He took the tag, fastened it to his bag, and stepped aside. The boarding announcement came, and Elijah lined up, gripping his backpack as if it were a lifeline. The hum of excitement that had filled his morning had quieted, replaced by an unfamiliar weight. When he entered the plane, his heart leapt at the sight of the cockpit door, knowing his father was just beyond it. He settled into the window seat his dad had chosen for him. A perfect spot to watch the wing in motion. But just as he began to relax, Megan appeared again, her expression firm. Unaccompanied minors sit in the back. It's policy, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Elijah blinked in confusion. But my dad. It's policy, she repeated, cutting him off. Reluctantly, Elijah gathered his things and moved to the cramped seat by the lavatory. The view from the small window was obstructed, and the constant sound of the door opening and closing filled the space. The excitement of the morning had dimmed. Seated nearby, an elderly man named Mr. Leonard watched the interaction unfold. His brows furrowed as he saw Elijah settle into the cramped seat, clutching his backpack. Quite the little traveler, aren't you? Mr. Leonard said kindly, leaning toward Elijah. Yes, sir, Elijah replied softly. My dad's the pilot on this flight. Mr. Leonard's expression softened. Well, now, that's something to be proud of. Not many get to fly with their family. Elijah's small smile returned, a flicker of pride sparking in his chest. But as Megan passed by again, her cold demeanor reminded him of the invisible wall between him and the world around him. In that moment, Elijah began to understand something he had always felt but never fully named. There were rules in the air, spoken and unspoken. Rules about where he belonged and how others saw him. He pressed his fingers to the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, holding tight to his father's words, "Keep your chin up." For Elijah, this was more than a flight. It was the beginning of a lesson about the skies and the world beneath them. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Elijah sat near the back, the muffled sounds of the lavatory door opening and closing an unwelcome backdrop to his thoughts. His fingers lightly traced the outline of the model plane nestled inside his backpack, seeking a sense of calm. Outside the small, obstructed window, the wing stretched into the sky, a stark reminder of the world he yearned to belong to. But belonging was tricky, fragile. It wasn't something you could always hold in your hands like a toy plane. And it wasn't always granted. Even when you'd done everything right. A flight attendant with a pleasant smile stopped at a nearby row, offering drinks and snacks. Her voice was warm, almost musical, as she chatted with a young couple. Watching the easy exchange, Elijah felt a pang of longing. When Megan Carter reached his row, her pleasantness dissolved like frost in sunlight. She looked down at him briefly, her expression cool. Would you like a drink? Yes, ma'am. May I have apple juice, please? Elijah asked politely, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his chest. She poured the juice with mechanical efficiency and placed it on his tray with a sharp thud. The liquid splashed over the rim, tiny droplets spreading across the tray. Thank you, Elijah said softly, his manners intact despite the sting of her dismissiveness. Across the aisle, an elderly woman named Mrs. Sanders observed the interaction, her knitting needles momentarily still in her lap. Her lips tightened as she watched Megan walk away, the flight attendant's demeanor noticeably warmer as she greeted the next passenger. That poor boy, Mrs. Sanders whispered to her seatmate, an elderly man in a tweed jacket. He's done nothing wrong, and she treats him like a bother. The man nodded solemnly. It's subtle, but you can see it. The way she softens her voice for some and hardens it for others. The murmurs of quiet disapproval were drowned out by the routine bustle of the flight crew. But they weren't unnoticed. Elijah, unaware of the passengers' growing concern, tried to distract himself by pulling out his sketchbook. Drawing airplanes had always been his favorite way to pass the time. With care, he began to sketch the wing outside his window, each line precise and deliberate. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Megan's approach until her shadow fell over him. This isn't an art class, young man, she said coldly, her tone slicing through his concentration. Be careful not to make a mess with those pencils. Elijah froze, his hand hovering over the page. I'm sorry, ma'am, he murmured, his voice barely audible. She didn't wait for a reply. Already moving on, Elijah hurried to gather his pencils and tuck them back into his bag, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Mrs. Sanders leaned toward her husband, her voice low but firm. "It's not just the boy she's dismissing," she said. "It's his right to be here, to take up space like anyone else." The elderly man sighed. "People like her, they don't even realize they're doing it. It's in the tone, the little gestures, the way they diminish you without even raising their voice." At the front of the cabin, Olivia Thompson, the co-pilot, moved gracefully through the aisle. She paused here and there, chatting briefly with passengers. When she reached Elijah's row, her keen eyes noticed the junior pilot wings on his jacket. She knelt to meet him at eye level. "Well, look at those wings," she said warmly, her voice brimming with encouragement. "You must be a big fan of flying." Elijah's face lit up, the shadows of the past hour briefly lifting. "Yes, ma'am, my dad gave me these. He's the pilot on this flight," he said proudly. Olivia's eyes sparkled. "Is that so? Well, it looks like we've got another pilot in the making. You're doing great, co-pilot." She gave him a wink before rising and continuing her rounds. For a moment, Elijah felt lighter, as if Olivia's warmth had softened the walls closing in around him. But the reprieve was brief. Not long after, a soft commotion drew his attention. A frail elderly woman in the aisle seat across from him struggled with her seatbelt, her hands trembling. "Excuse me," she said to Megan, who was passing by with the meal cart. "Could you help me with this? My arthritis makes it hard to manage." Megan barely glanced at her. "I'll be back in a minute," she said curtly, pushing the cart down the aisle. Elijah hesitated for only a moment before unbuckling his seatbelt and crossing the aisle. "May I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice kind and steady. The woman looked up in surprise, her face softening with gratitude. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, her tone warm. Elijah carefully secured the seatbelt, ensuring it was fastened properly. He gave her a small nod before returning to his seat. Just as he settled back in, Megan's sharp voice cut through the air. "What are you doing out of your seat?" she demanded, her tone icy. Elijah looked up, startled. "I was just helping her with her seatbelt," he said softly. "That's not your responsibility," Megan snapped. "Rules exist for a reason. Stay in your seat and don't move again." Elijah nodded, his head lowering under the weight of her reprimand. Mrs. Sanders, watching the exchange, could no longer hold her tongue. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "That boy was showing kindness. Something you seem to be in short supply of today." Megan's expression tightened, but she said nothing, moving briskly down the aisle. The passengers around Elijah began to exchange murmurs, their discontent with Megan's behavior growing louder. The young mother a few rows up whispered to her husband, "That boy's done nothing wrong, and she's treating him like a problem." Her husband nodded. "It's like she's punishing him for simply existing." Elijah sat quietly, his fingers brushing over the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Keep your chin up. You belong." But in that moment, surrounded by whispers and cold stares, he couldn't help but wonder if the sky, the place he had dreamed of, held invisible lines he hadn't yet learned to navigate. Lines drawn not by altitude or weather, but by the fragile, unspoken boundaries of a world unwilling to see him for who he truly was. The airplane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines became a steady rhythm in the background. Passengers were settling into their routines, opening books, scrolling through screens, or leaning back for a nap. But Elijah sat still, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized seat. His backpack, now tucked under his knees, felt heavier than ever. The junior pilot wings on his jacket shimmered faintly under the cabin lights, but their presence only added to the quiet weight pressing on him. He stared out the window, his view of the wing partially obstructed by the cramped seat near the lavatory. The excitement he'd carried with him that morning now felt far away, like a dream he could barely remember. Nearby, Mrs. Sanders observed him with quiet dismay. She had watched Megan's icy demeanor shift to warmth for nearly every other passenger. Her hand hovered over her knitting needles, hesitating between staying silent or saying something. "Elijah," she finally said softly, leaning slightly toward him, "that's a lovely pin you've got there. Are you a big fan of planes?" Elijah glanced at her, his face lighting up momentarily at her kind tone. "Yes, ma'am, my dad gave it to me. He's the pilot of this flight," he said, his voice tinged with pride. Mrs. Sanders smiled warmly, her knitting forgotten. "Well, now, isn't that wonderful? You must be very proud of him." "I am," Elijah replied, but his voice faltered slightly. The shadow of his earlier encounters lingered. Further down the aisle, Megan returned with the meal cart, her movements brisk and efficient. She stopped at each row, her polite smile practiced but sincere enough for the passengers who came before Elijah. But as she approached his seat, her demeanor shifted. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. Her tone clipped. "Yes, ma'am, may I have a sandwich, please?" Elijah replied, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Without meeting his gaze, Megan placed the tray on his table with a firm thud, the sandwich sliding slightly to the edge. "Be careful not to make a mess," she said sharply. Elijah nodded, swallowing his frustration. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." Across the aisle, Mr. Leonard, who had been quietly observing, cleared his throat. "Miss, I couldn't help but notice that you seem to have an awfully heavy hand with that boy," he said, his voice calm but pointed. Megan froze for a fraction of a second before responding, her tone defensive. "I'm simply ensuring that everyone follows the rules, sir." Mr. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Rules are one thing, but there's a way to enforce them without making a child feel like a nuisance." The murmurs from other passengers grew louder. A young mother with a toddler leaned toward her husband, whispering fiercely, "It's not just about rules. She's going out of her way to single him out." Her husband nodded, his brow furrowing. "You can feel it. It's in the way she talks to him. It's subtle, but it's there." Megan turned on her heel, pushing the cart down the aisle without another word. Elijah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He felt the eyes of the passengers on him, not judging, but quietly supportive, and yet it made him feel even smaller. His father's words, "Keep your chin up," echoed in his mind, but the weight of the moment made it difficult. As he sat staring at his untouched sandwich, Olivia Thompson appeared again, her presence a balm against the tension lingering in the air. She knelt beside Elijah, her expression warm and genuine. "Hey there, co-pilot," she said softly. "How's everything going back here?" Elijah looked up, his lips curving into a faint smile. "It's okay, ma'am," he replied, though his voice betrayed the ache he was trying to hide. Olivia glanced at the sandwich precariously balanced on his tray and then at the faint flush on his cheeks. Her gaze softened. "You know," she said, her voice kind but steady, "every pilot has to deal with a bit of turbulence now and then. It's not easy, but it's part of the job." Elijah nodded, her words sinking in. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Olivia's eyes glimmered with encouragement. "You're doing great, Elijah, and don't forget you've got a team up front who believes in you." As she stood and moved down the aisle, her words left a faint warmth in their wake. But that warmth was quickly tested when Megan returned, this time carrying a stack of in-flight activity sheets. She stopped at Elijah's row, holding out the papers without looking at him. "Here, maybe this will keep you busy," she said curtly, as if his quiet presence were somehow a disruption. Elijah hesitated before taking the sheets. "Thank you," he said softly, his fingers brushing the edges of the pages. "Just don't get ink on the seat," Megan added, her tone sharp. "We have enough to clean without extra messes." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Elijah's grip on the papers tightened. Mr. Leonard's voice cut through the tension. "Miss, I think it's time you took a break," he said, his tone calm but firm. Megan turned to him, her professional mask slipping slightly. "Excuse me?" Mr. Leonard met her gaze steadily. "You've made your point several times. In fact, now it's time to let the boy enjoy his flight." The murmurs from other passengers grew louder, their voices carrying a quiet solidarity. Megan's lips tightened as she turned and walked away, her steps brisk. Elijah's shoulders sagged slightly in relief, but the weight of the experience lingered. He stared down at the activity sheets, his fingers tracing the faint outlines of the puzzles and drawings. Across the aisle, Mrs. Sanders leaned toward him. "You're doing just fine, Elijah," she said softly. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. For the first time since the flight began, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, something like hope. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt, But it was a start. And as the plane soared above the clouds, Elijah held on to that flicker, determined to keep his chin up. Just as his father had taught him, the airplane hummed along steadily, its engines a soothing monotone against the ever-present murmur of passengers. Yet, for Elijah, the sound no longer brought comfort. It was a backdrop to the rising tension that had taken root since the flight began, a quiet unease that simmered just beneath the surface. The cabin had become its own fragile ecosystem, and Elijah could feel the unspoken shift in the air. It wasn't just Megan Carter's clipped words or cold stares. It was the way others around him seemed to notice and either look away or lean in with concern. The young boy was no stranger to the feeling, though he couldn't yet name it. It was the weight of being seen and unseen all at once. Across the aisle, Mrs. Sanders continued her quiet vigil, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm that mirrored her growing disapproval. She exchanged glances with Mr. Leonard, who had folded his newspaper and was watching Megan as she moved briskly up the aisle. "She doesn't even realize what she's doing, does she?" Mrs. Sanders murmured, her voice low but firm. "Oh, she knows," Mr. Leonard replied, "maybe not consciously, but she knows. It's in the way she changes her tone, her body language. It's as clear as day." At the front of the cabin, Olivia Thompson appeared again, walking with purpose. Her gaze swept over the passengers before landing on Elijah, who sat quietly with his activity sheet in hand. She stopped near his row, her presence a gentle contrast to the sharpness that had defined the earlier interactions. "How's it going, co-pilot?" she asked warmly. Kneeling beside him, Elijah looked up, his expression hesitant but hopeful. "It's okay, ma'am," he said softly. Olivia smiled, her voice lowering just enough to feel like a private conversation. "You know, every pilot faces challenges. Sometimes it's bad weather, sometimes it's a tricky landing. But the key is to stay steady no matter what." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied, his small fingers brushing over the junior pilot wings on his jacket. Her words were a lifeline, but the moment was short-lived. Megan's voice cut through the cabin as she returned with another tray of drinks, her movements brisk and sharp. "Elijah," she called, her tone sterner than necessary. "You've been up and down enough for one flight. Stay seated unless absolutely necessary. Am I clear?" Elijah blinked, confused by the sudden reprimand. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Sanders put down her knitting, her expression hardening. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "The boy has been nothing but polite. I'd appreciate it if you spoke to him with the same courtesy you show everyone else." Megan turned, her professional smile faltering for the briefest moment. "I'm just following protocol," she said, her voice tight. "Protocol isn't an excuse for rudeness," Mrs. Sanders replied, her eyes narrowing. The exchange caught the attention of other passengers. A young mother shifted in her seat, whispering to her husband, while a businessman 2 rows ahead turned slightly, his brow furrowed. The murmurs of quiet dissent grew louder. Meanwhile, Elijah sat frozen, his fingers clutching the edges of his tray. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but the feeling of being unfairly targeted gnawed at him. He thought of his father's words, "Keep your chin up. You belong," but they felt harder to hold on to with each passing moment. The older man in the aisle seat leaned toward him. "Don't let it get to you, son," Mr. Leonard said gently. "Sometimes people carry things inside them that they don't even realize. That doesn't make it right. But it's not a reflection on you." Elijah nodded, his eyes meeting Mr. Leonard's. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice steadying slightly. Megan moved further down the aisle, her professional demeanor firmly back in place. But the tension lingered. As the plane hit a patch of turbulence, the cabin jolted slightly, and passengers tightened their seatbelts. Megan returned to Elijah's row to check on him, but even her concern carried an edge. "Is everything secure here?" she asked, her tone curt. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied. "Good," she said briskly, before moving on without another glance. The turbulence passed quickly, but the unease it left behind did not. At the front of the cabin, Olivia stood near the cockpit door, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She saw the subtle shift in body language among the passengers, the way heads turned slightly toward Elijah, the whispers exchange, the faint looks of disapproval aimed at Megan. It was clear to her that something deeper was at play. Olivia stepped back into the cabin and approached Megan, catching her by the galley. "Megan," she said softly but firmly. "Can we talk?" Megan stiffened slightly, her eyes darting to the passengers nearby. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone defensive. Olivia's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "I've flown with you for years. You're one of the best at what you do. But I think you're carrying something today that's affecting the way you're treating that boy." Megan's eyes flickered with unease. "I don't know what you mean. I'm following policy." "There's policy," Olivia said gently, "and then there's how we make people feel. That boy hasn't done anything wrong. But you've made him feel like he doesn't belong. You may not see it, but everyone else does." Megan's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. Olivia's words hung in the air like a challenge. Back at his seat, Elijah pulled out his sketchbook again, this time sketching the faint outline of a plane wing against the sky. He kept his movements small, hoping to avoid further attention. Around him, the passengers continued to exchange quiet glances. The tension in the cabin had taken on a life of its own, spreading in subtle waves. And yet, amid the discomfort, something else was beginning to stir. It was in the way Mr. Leonard leaned forward to offer a kind word. It was in the way Mrs. Sanders resumed her knitting with renewed determination. It was in the way the young mother whispered fiercely to her husband, her resolve growing stronger. It was the quiet beginnings of solidarity, a recognition of injustice, however small, and a shared decision not to look away. As the plane continued its journey, the passengers' murmurs grew louder, their voices rising against the unspoken lines drawn in the cabin. Elijah, still clutching his pencil, could feel the faint shift in the air. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't as alone as he thought. The plane sailed smoothly above the clouds, the horizon stretching endlessly, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Tension clung to the air like a low, steady hum, the kind of discomfort that no one acknowledged aloud but everyone could feel. For Elijah, the hum was deafening. It rang in the clipped tone of Megan Carter's voice, in the way her eyes swept past him as if he were a piece of luggage. In the silence that followed her every dismissal, he sat quietly, his junior pilot wings catching the faint cabin light. The metal pin, so small and unassuming, felt heavier now, as if it carried not just his dreams but also the weight of proving he belonged. Megan returned to his row, this time with the dessert cart. Her smile, which had been polite for every passenger before him, disappeared as she stopped by his seat. "Would you like something?" she asked, her voice cold. "Yes, ma'am. May I have a cookie, please?" Elijah replied, his tone steady but hesitant. Megan placed the cookie on his tray with such force that it nearly slid off. She didn't meet his eyes. "Be careful. Don't make a mess," she said sharply before moving on. Across the aisle, Mrs. Sanders set her knitting down again. Her patience, already thin, had run out. "Miss Carter," she called, her voice ringing out louder than before. Megan stopped, her shoulders stiffening. She turned slowly, her expression guarded. "Yes? That's enough," Mrs. Sanders said firmly. "You've been singling that boy out since this flight began, and it's unacceptable." A few heads turned, passengers who had been quietly observing now leaning in closer. "I don't know what you're implying," Megan replied, her tone defensive. "Oh, you know exactly what I'm implying," Mrs. Sanders shot back. "You've treated him differently from everyone else on this plane, and we've all seen it." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A young mother nodded, her toddler squirming in her lap. "She's right," the woman said, her voice tinged with anger. "He's just a child. Why are you treating him like he's a problem?" A businessman seated 2 rows up chimed in, his tone measured but firm. "I travel every week, and I've never seen a flight attendant behave like this. It's unnecessary, and frankly, it's unprofessional." Megan's face flushed, but she didn't respond. Her gaze darted briefly toward Elijah, who sat frozen in his seat, unsure of where to look or what to say. "It's not just about this flight," Mr. Leonard added, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about the way people like him are treated every day. You think he doesn't notice? You think he doesn't feel it? He may be a boy, but he's not blind." The cabin fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Olivia Thompson appeared from the front of the plane, her steps purposeful. She had been monitoring the growing tension from a distance, but now it was clear that action was needed. "What's going on here?" Olivia asked, her tone calm but commanding. The passengers turned to her, their collective frustration palpable. Mrs. Sanders spoke first. "This flight attendant has been treating that boy unfairly since we took off. We've all seen it." Olivia's sharp eyes flicked to Megan, who stood rigid, her professional mask slipping. Then she turned to Elijah, who looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Elijah," Olivia said softly, kneeling beside him, "are you okay?" "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied, though his voice wavered. Olivia placed a reassuring hand on his arm before straightening and turning to Megan. "Can we speak in the galley?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Megan hesitated but nodded, following Olivia to the back of the plane. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder in their absence. "This isn't just about one flight," Mrs. Sanders said to Mr. Leonard, her voice quieter now but still charged with emotion. "It's about all the little ways people like him are made to feel small. It's like death by 1,000 cuts." Mr. Leonard nodded, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "And it starts young. They make you question yourself before you even know who you are." Meanwhile, in the galley, Olivia stood facing Megan, her arms crossed. "What's going on, Megan?" Olivia asked, her voice low but firm. "I don't know what everyone's so upset about." Megan replied defensively. "I've been following protocol. Protocol doesn't explain why you've been treating that boy differently from everyone else." Olivia said sharply, "You're projecting something onto him. And it's not fair. He's done nothing wrong." Megan's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean to. But you did," Olivia interrupted, her tone softening. "And the passengers see it. They feel it, and so does he. Do you want to be the reason a child loses faith in the kindness of others?" Megan's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of Olivia's words sinking in. Back in the cabin, Elijah sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, not judging, but watchful, protective even. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone in this. When Olivia and Megan returned, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Megan approached Elijah's seat, her steps slow and deliberate. She knelt beside him, her expression uncharacteristically soft. "Elijah," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I owe you an apology. I've been unfair to you. And I'm sorry." Elijah looked at her, his small face thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing slightly. As Megan stood and returned to her duties, Olivia knelt beside Elijah once more. "You handled that with a lot of grace," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Your dad would be proud." Elijah smiled faintly, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. For the rest of the flight, the passengers around him continued to watch over him, their quiet solidarity a shield against the subtle injustices that had marred his journey. And though the plane's path remained steady, the cabin itself had changed. In its own way, it had become a battleground, one where kindness and dignity had begun to win. For Elijah, the lesson was clear. The skies are vast. But even here, the fight for belonging remains. The plane began its slow descent, the announcement from the cockpit marking the transition from cruising to approach. The steady hum of the engines remained unchanged, but the air in the cabin was heavier now, charged with an energy that refused to dissipate. Passengers shifted in their seats, their movements small but laden with meaning, folded arms, exchanged glances, murmured words of quiet defiance. Elijah sat in silence near the back of the plane, his small frame dwarfed by the seat, his sketchbook clutched in his hands. The junior pilot wings on his jacket gleamed faintly in the dim cabin light, a quiet but undeniable emblem of his connection to the man in the cockpit. Yet, even with that symbol, the gap between who he was and how he was treated felt insurmountable. Megan Carter, her usual briskness now softened by Olivia's intervention, moved through the aisle with purposeful restraint. She avoided Elijah's row entirely, her earlier confidence shaken. The passengers noticed, and the quiet murmurs among them grew louder. Emboldened by her retreat, "She knows," Mrs. Sanders whispered to Mr. Leonard, her knitting needles now motionless in her lap. "She knows she was wrong. But knowing doesn't undo the harm. Does it?" "No, it doesn't," Mr. Leonard replied. "It's not just about what she did. It's about what it means." Across the aisle, a young mother shifted her toddler onto her lap, her voice low but resolute as she whispered to her husband, "It's always like this. isn't it? They make you feel like you don't belong, even when you've done everything right." Her husband nodded solemnly, his eyes fixed on Elijah. "And it starts so young. That boy will carry this with him, whether he realizes it or not." The quiet solidarity among the passengers began to take shape, no longer a mere collection of shared glances but a growing tide of resolve. At the front of the plane, Olivia Thompson emerged from the cockpit, her presence as steady as the plane's trajectory. She walked purposefully toward Elijah's row, her calm demeanor a balm against the tension that filled the cabin. "Hey there, co-pilot," she said, kneeling beside Elijah's seat. Her voice was warm, her gaze unwavering. Elijah looked up at her, his eyes bright but cautious. "Yes, ma'am?" Olivia's smile was gentle. "We're about to land, but I wanted to check on you first. How are you holding up?" Elijah hesitated, his small hands tightening around his sketchbook. "I'm okay," he said finally, his voice steady but quiet. Olivia nodded, her expression softening. "You've handled yourself with a lot of grace, Elijah, more than most adults would in your shoes." She glanced at the junior pilot wings on his jacket, her eyes shining with encouragement. "You're going to make a fine pilot someday. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Elijah's lips curved into a small smile, the first genuine one in hours. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. As Olivia stood, she turned her attention to the passengers nearby. Her gaze was steady, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you all for your patience during this flight," she said, her words carrying a deeper weight than they might have otherwise. "It's been a journey in more ways than one." The passengers exchanged knowing glances, their quiet unity solidified by her acknowledgement. Megan, standing near the galley, watched Olivia's interaction with Elijah from a distance. Her expression was unreadable, but her rigid posture had softened. The murmurs of discontent among the passengers had grown louder, their shared disapproval now impossible to ignore. As the plane descended further, the seatbelt sign illuminated, and the cabin lights dimmed. Elijah gazed out the window, the city below glowing like scattered jewels against the darkness. The sight filled him with a sense of awe, momentarily distracting him from the events of the flight. But the momentary peace was interrupted as Megan approached his row once more. Her steps were slower this time, her expression hesitant. She knelt beside Elijah, her voice quiet but trembling slightly. "Elijah," she began, her tone softer than it had been all flight. "I want to apologize again for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Elijah looked at her, his small face thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded. "Thank you, ma'am," he said simply, his voice calm but sincere. Megan's eyes flickered with something in spoken regret, perhaps, or recognition. She nodded and stood, retreating to the galley. The passengers, who had been watching the exchange intently, exchanged approving glances. Mrs. Sanders leaned toward Mr. Leonard, her voice low but firm. "It's a step," she said, "but one apology doesn't erase everything." "No, it doesn't," Mr. Leonard agreed, "but it's a start." As the plane touched down, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of landing, the soft thud of wheels against tarmac, the whir of the engines powering down, the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. Elijah sat quietly, his sketchbook and model plane safely tucked into his backpack. He felt the weight of the flight in his chest, but also a faint sense of relief. The ordeal was over, and soon he would see his father again. As the passengers began to disembark, many paused to offer him small gestures of kindness, a warm smile, a nod of encouragement, a whispered word of support. "You're a brave young man," Mrs. Sanders said as she passed, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder. "Don't ever forget that. Keep dreaming big, son," Mr. Leonard added, his voice steady and kind. Elijah nodded, his small smile growing. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. When he finally stepped into the terminal, his father was waiting for him, his tall figure a beacon of strength and familiarity. "There's my boy," Captain Williams said, his voice warm and steady as he knelt to embrace Elijah. Elijah felt the weight of the flight begin to lift as he buried his face in his father's shoulder. "I missed you, Dad," he said softly. "I missed you too, buddy," Captain Williams replied, his voice tinged with pride. "How was the flight?" Elijah hesitated, his mind flickering through the moments of tension and kindness, the sharp words and quiet solidarity. "It was different," he said finally. Captain Williams studied his son's face. His expression thoughtful. Different isn't always bad, he said gently. Sometimes it just means you've learned something new. Elijah nodded, his father's words sinking in. I think I did, he said softly. As they walked toward the exit, Elijah glanced back at the terminal. The events of the flight still fresh in his mind. He knew he would carry the memory with him, not just the challenges, but the quiet acts of courage and kindness that had made all the difference. For now, though, the sky felt a little closer, and the weight of the world a little lighter. The terminal was a bustling hive of movement and sound. Travelers rushed to make connections. Families reunited with hugs and laughter. And the announcement of arrivals and departures echoed through the cavernous space. Yet for Elijah, the noise seemed distant, a muted backdrop to the thoughts swirling in his mind. The embrace with his father had brought some relief, but the weight of the flight still clung to him. It wasn't just Megan Carter's coldness or the whispered solidarity of the passengers. It was the sense that something larger, something deeper, had been at play. At 9 years old, Elijah couldn't yet articulate it, but he felt it in his chest. Heavy and unrelenting, Captain Isaac Williams walked beside his son, his pilot's uniform crisp and commanding. People glanced at him with respect as they passed, their gazes lingering on his golden stripes and upright posture. Elijah saw the way they looked at his father, and it filled him with pride but also with questions he couldn't quite put into words. Did you enjoy the flight, buddy? Isaac asked, his voice warm but probing. Elijah hesitated, his small hand gripping the strap of his backpack. It was okay, he said quietly. Isaac stopped, kneeling to meet his son's eyes. Just okay? What happened? Elijah's gaze dropped to the floor. I don't think the flight attendant liked me very much, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Isaac's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. What do you mean? He asked, his voice steady but edged with concern. Elijah shrugged, trying to find the right words. She was different with me. She talked to the other passengers nicer, and she made me move my seat. Isaac's eyes darkened, but he placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. I see, he said softly. Well, you know what I told you, keep your chin up, no matter what. Yes, sir, Elijah replied, his voice stronger now. As they walked toward the baggage claim, Elijah noticed the glances they received. Some were friendly, acknowledging his father's uniform with a nod or smile. Others lingered too long, their expressions unreadable but heavy with something that felt vaguely familiar. Isaac noticed too. His hand rested protectively on Elijah's shoulder, a silent reminder that he was not alone. At the baggage carousel, a group of passengers from the flight had gathered. Mrs. Sanders was there, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, and Mr. Leonard stood nearby, his cane resting against his leg. They exchanged warm smiles with Elijah, their presence a quiet reassurance. You did great, young man, Mr. Leonard said, his voice steady and kind. You handled yourself better than most adults would have. Elijah smiled shyly. Thank you, sir. Mrs. Sanders nodded in agreement. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Elijah. Don't let anyone dim that light. As the baggage carousel rumbled to life, Megan Carter appeared, her uniform immaculate but her expression less confident than it had been on the plane. She hesitated when she saw Isaac and Elijah, her steps faltering. Captain Williams, she said, her voice formal but tinged with unease. I wanted to speak to you and your son. Isaac's expression remained neutral, but there was an edge to his posture. Go ahead, he said calmly. Megan looked at Elijah, her gaze softening. Elijah, I owe you another apology. I wasn't fair to you on the flight, and I regret the way I treated you. You deserved better. Elijah glanced up at his father, who gave him a small nod. Turning back to Megan, Elijah replied, Thank you, ma'am, I forgive you. Megan's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she offered a faint smile before stepping away. Mrs. Sanders watched her leave, her brow furrowed. It's good she apologized, she said quietly to Mr. Leonard. But an apology doesn't fix the larger issue. No, it doesn't, Mr. Leonard replied, but it's a start. The rest, well, that's up to the world we leave behind. Isaac crouched to Elijah's level, his expression serious but kind. Son, he began, what happened on that flight wasn't right. And it's not the first time something like this will happen. But you handled it with dignity. And that's what matters. Elijah nodded, his young mind beginning to grasp the complexity of his father's words. "You see, buddy," Isaac continued, "there are people in this world who will judge you before they even know you. Sometimes it's subtle, like a look or a tone of voice. Other times it's more obvious. But no matter what, you have to remember who you are and what you stand for." "Yes, sir," Elijah said, his voice resolute. Isaac smiled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "And who you are is my son. A future pilot with dreams as big as the sky. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." As they left the terminal, the sun was setting, casting the world in hues of gold and orange. Elijah looked up at the sky, his heart lighter now. He knew the path ahead wouldn't always be easy. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The world was full of challenges, of invisible lines and unspoken rules. But it was also full of kindness, of people like Olivia, Mr. Leonard, and Mrs. Sanders. And as long as he carried their words with him, as long as he kept his chin up, he knew he could face whatever lay ahead. For now, the sky stretched wide and endless before him, a reminder of all the possibilities waiting just beyond the horizon. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. Outside the terminal, the hum of engines and the chatter of travelers filled the air. But to Elijah, the world felt quieter now. As he walked beside his father, Captain Isaac Williams, the weight of the day lingered, its lessons both sharp and profound. The cab ride to his aunt's house was uneventful, the city lights flickering by in a steady rhythm. Elijah sat silently, staring out the window, his reflection superimposed against the passing streets. Isaac watched his son carefully, his pilot's composure steady but his eyes betraying a father's concern. "You're quiet," Isaac said finally, his voice soft. Elijah turned to him, his young face contemplative. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant, "why did she act like that? The flight attendant?" Isaac took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He had known this question was coming. But the answer was one he wished his son didn't have to hear so soon. "Sometimes, people let their fears or their ignorance guide how they treat others," Isaac said carefully. "They see someone who looks different from them, and instead of being curious or kind, they assume the worst. It's not right, but it happens." Elijah nodded slowly, the words sinking in. "But I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "No, you didn't," Isaac replied firmly. "And that's the hardest part. Son, sometimes, you'll face things that have nothing to do with what you've done and everything to do with what someone else is carrying inside them." "But why me?" Elijah asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Isaac turned to him, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Because, Elijah, you represent something bigger than yourself. When you walk into a room or onto a plane, you carry not just who you are, but all the possibilities of who you could be. That scares some people, but it also inspires others. And that's why you have to keep going." The cab pulled up to the house, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Elijah and Isaac stepped out, the warm glow of the porch light welcoming them. His aunt, a cheerful woman with a quick laugh and open arms, greeted them at the door. "Elijah, look at you, young man," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. "You must be tired after your big adventure." Elijah smiled faintly, the warmth of her embrace easing some of the day's tension. "It was different," he said, echoing his earlier words to his father. His aunt glanced at Isaac, a question in her eyes. He shook his head slightly, silently telling her they'd talk later. As they sat down for dinner, Elijah listened to the adults' conversation, his thoughts drifting back to the flight. He thought of Megan's cold tone, the quiet support of the passengers, and Olivia's encouraging words. He thought of how it had felt to sit in the cramped seat near the lavatory, the weight of invisibility pressing down on him. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he heard his father and aunt talking softly in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the words carried. "He handled it better than I expected," Isaac said, "but it's hard knowing he had to face that." "He's a strong boy," his aunt replied, "but it's not fair. He's just a child." Isaac sighed. "It's not fair, but this is the world we live in. And as much as I want to shield him from it, I can't. All I can do is prepare him." Elijah turned onto his side, their words settling over him like a blanket, heavy, but strangely comforting. The next morning, as the sun rose and painted the room in soft light, Elijah pulled out his sketchbook. He flipped to a fresh page. his pencil poised above the paper. Slowly, he began to draw the airplane from the flight, its wings stretching across the page. But this time, he added something new. In the background, he sketched the faces of the people who had supported him: Mrs. Sanders, her knitting needles in hand; Mr. Leonard, his cane resting beside him; the young mother with her toddler; and Olivia, her warm smile steady and reassuring. When he finished, he sat back and studied the drawing. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. Later, when his father came to check on him, Elijah held up the sketch. "Do you think I'll really be a pilot someday?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Isaac knelt beside him, his eyes scanning the drawing. "I don't just think it," he said, his voice steady. "I know it. You've already proven you have what it takes." Elijah smiled, a spark of determination returning to his eyes. "Then I'll keep going," he said, "no matter what." Isaac placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his pride unmistakable. "That's my boy." As they stepped outside into the morning air, the sky stretched wide and endless above them. For Elijah, it was no longer just a place of dreams. It was a place of challenges. Yes, but also of possibilities. And as he gazed up at the horizon, he knew he was ready to face it all. Because beneath the same sky, everyone carries something. But Elijah had learned that even in the face of fear or ignorance, kindness, courage, and resilience could carry him further than he ever imagined.